So today I'm going to talk our way through lab number 15. That's the digestive system. We've already talked about the digestive system in lecture, but now we're covering some of the lab components, which include some of the microscopic components, as well as the gross anatomy of the digestive system. So we're focusing on those parts of the digestive system that can be viewed in the lab setting. And that means we're going to be doing it online. So on this first slide is a cartoon version of the digestive system. Remember that the digestive system, or the gastrointestinal system, is this complex disassembly line where food that's ingested, that is brought into the mouth or the buccal cavity, and this is where some mechanical digestion begins. That's breaking food apart into smaller bits, as well as some chemical digestion. We have salivary amylase that starts to break down starches. Then that partially digested food continues into, this is supposed to be the stomach here. And the stomach has the additions of enzymes and acids, that's what's shown here, to continue to break down that food. And once it leaves the stomach through that pyloric sphincter, then it's considered chyme, and it's traveling now through the small intestine. The small intestine is where the primary bulk of digestion as well as absorption occurs. So that's what's shown here, the secretion of digestive enzymes, of pancreatic juice, of bile, all being added to the chyme as it's traveling through the small intestine. And here we have products being absorbed from the small intestine. And that chyme is continuing and now entering into the large intestine, or the large bowel. And here's where microorganisms are further processing undigested material and removing a lot of water from that undigested material. And finally, those undigested foods get eliminated through the anus by the process of defecation. So this is showing this whole process of ingestion, mechanical and chemical digestion, absorption, and elimination. So I'll roughly be following along with your lab manual and showing some of the things that you would need to know if we were in the lab physically. The first one is something that we talked about in the lecture already, and that's the 4 major tissue layers, or the tunics, going from the lumen to the surface within the GI tract. So the innermost is that layer that we talked about, the mucosa, a highly specialized mucous membrane that consists of an epithelial layer, then of the lamina propria, and then the muscularis mucosa, that thin layer of muscle that can throw the mucosa into longitudinal folds. So all 3 of these are the mucosa. The next layer is the submucosa, a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue. And in the submucosa, you'll see blood vessels, glands, nerves, and lymphoid tissue. Then the next layer is the muscularis externa, this thick muscular layer. And throughout the digestive tract, it's primarily these 2 layers, the inner circular layer, that when it contracts, decreases the diameter of the lumen. And on top of that, the outer longitudinal muscle layer, and that decreases the length of the gastrointestinal tract when it contracts. The outer layer is the serosa, or the visceral peritoneum. So it's the visceral serosa that's covering the entire GI tract, except for certain parts that are covered by the adventitia. So that outermost layer is going to be the serosa through most of the GI tract, and the adventitia in the oral cavity, and the esophagus in the far end of the rectum. If we look at them under the microscope, then you'll be able to identify the 4 different tunics and their general features. And we'll also be looking at the distinct histological characteristics of each region. So in this slide, number 1 indicates the mucosa. Number 2 indicates the submucosa, and number 3 indicates the muscularis externa. The serosa or the adventitia won't always be clearly visible. Over here, this big region is the mucosa, and deep to it, the submucosa, and then the muscularis externa, and the serosa or adventitia would be that outermost layer. So specific characteristics that we're going to look for in these 4 tunics. First, we're looking at the histology of the esophagus. Remember that the esophagus is that muscular tube that extends from the pharynx down to the stomach. What's unique about the mucosa of the esophagus is that it's stratified squamous epithelium. So this is non-keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. This is to resist abrasion from food. So that's going to be the distinguishing characteristic for the mucosa of the esophagus. In the submucosa, you'd see scattered mucus glands. In the muscularis externa, and we're going to see those inner circular and outer longitudinal muscle layer. And the outer layer is the adventitia. So there's no serosa, there's an adventitia that's anchoring the esophagus into its position. Continuing onward through the GI tract, in the stomach, what's unique about the mucosa is it's this simple columnar or cuboidal epithelium that's functioning as a secretory sheet that blankets the epithelium with a protective layer of mucus. And evident across the surface are these shallow depressions that are called gastric pits, and they're lined with mucus gland cells that extend down deep into the lamina propria. And down in the lamina propria, you'll find the gastric glands. Those gastric glands contain some different types of secretory cells. So they have chief cells that secrete pepsinogen and gastric lipase, parietal cells that are secreting hydrochloric acid, as well as enteroendocrine cells that are secreting hormones that affect other portions of the gastrointestinal tract. Within the stomach wall, not seen here, what we'll also be able to see are the 3 layers of muscle. So because so much mechanical digestion occurs within the stomach, there's not just the outer longitudinal and that inner circular layer, there's also going to be an inner oblique layer that really adds to the mechanical powers of the stomach. We continue to move down through the gastrointestinal tract. In the small intestine, it's divided up into 3 different regions. The first one, the duodenum, is the first segment of the small intestine. It's the shortest, it's the widest segment that forms a C shape. The next section, the jejunum, is about 2/5 of the length of the small intestine, and this is where most of that chemical absorption is going to be taking place, chemical absorption and digestion. And the last section is the ileum, and that's about the last 3/5 of the length of the small intestine. So for all 3 of these sections, we're going to see the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa with its 2 layers, those inner circular and outer longitudinal muscle layers, and then the serosa surrounding it. To figure out what section of the small intestine you're in, you're going to look for the presence of something exciting in the submucosa. So in the duodenum, in the submucosa, what you'll find are these duodenal glands, or sometimes called Brunner's glands, and these are responsible for secreting an alkaline fluid that helps to neutralize acidity coming from the stomach. In the jejunum, there's not going to be any interesting features within the submucosa, but you will see really tall villi. Remember that villi are those structures that serve to increase surface area for absorption in the small intestine. So this makes sense because most of that absorption is taking place in the jejunum. And then in that last section, the ileum, what you'll see are these large nodules within the submucosa. And those are lymph nodules, or called Peyer's patches. They're important in immune surveillance. So they're monitoring, making sure that none of the bacteria that are resident in the large intestine move back up into the small intestine. So when you look at the duodenum under the microscope, what you'll see is this is the mucosal layer. And then this is the submucosa. And all of these gland-looking structures are the duodenal glands, or the Brunner's glands, that are secreting that alkaline fluid. Then there's the muscularis externa that's external to that. So you're looking in the submucosa to see if there's anything interesting going on. Here it's glands, so you know you're in the duodenum. This is a section of the jejunum. So up here, all of this is that really tall villi. So really tall villi that are responsible for absorption. You know you're in the jejunum. Down here in the submucosa, nothing interesting going on, no glands, no Peyer's patches. So you know you're in the jejunum. And then the muscularis externa here. And now you know that you're in the ileum, because up here is the mucosa. And then down here in the submucosa, holy cannoli, look at these giant Peyer's patches, or lymph nodules. These are what's responsible for that immune surveillance at that distal end of the small intestine. So all of this is the submucosa, and then out here, the muscularis externa. So you'll also need to identify the body cavities, or the body spaces that house and protect the internal organs. Remember that these are lined with serous membranes. And this ventral body cavity is the largest one in the body, and it's subdivided up into the pleural, the pericardial, and the abdominopelvic cavity. And the abdominopelvic cavity is where we'll be finding a majority of the body's visceral organs, these digestive organs. And it's subdivided up by this large, complexly folded serous membrane. The serous membrane that lines the cavity wall is the parietal peritoneum, and that which is lining the organs is called the visceral peritoneum, or the serosa. These serous membranes are continuous sheets of cells that can run off the walls over the organs. When they come together and they meet, they form an overlapping fold, this double membrane structure that's called a mesentery. And these mesenteries are functioning to stabilize often these very mobile organs, as well as providing protected routes for blood vessels, nerves, and lymph vessels to be able to get to those organs of interest. So these mesenteries are named for their location, so are the organs that they're in contact with or attached to. And I showed you in lecture already that this over here is just meant to be a diagrammatic or a schematic view of what's over here on the left. So we talked in lecture about how the mesentery that supports the liver and appears to divide it into left and right halves. That's the falciform ligament. The mesentery that attaches to the lesser curvature of the stomach and hangs on the stomach. That's that lesser omentum. This one that hangs down from the stomach and forms an apron-like flap. That's the greater omentum. The mesentery that secures the colon. That's the same thing as the large intestine. That's the mesocolon, or the mesentery of the large intestine. And then the mesenteries that secure the small intestines are called the mesentery proper or the mesentery of the small intestine. So here's a view of some of these mesenteries. We have the lesser omentum right here, securing the lesser curvature of the stomach, and this big greater omentum hanging down from the greater curvature of the stomach. Up here would be the falciform ligament that appears to divide the liver into left and right halves. So here's another view of the liver. This would be the diaphragm up here. And this would be the falciform ligament right here. And then this remnant down here is the round ligament. And this is a remnant of a fetal umbilical vein. And it's this thickening of the anterior border of the falciform ligament. And we'll talk more about the fetal circulation system when we get into the circulatory system. Here's a view of some more of these mesenteries. So we can still see the lesser omentum securing that lesser curvature of the stomach. In this image, the liver has been removed. Here's the cut edge of the greater omentum hanging down from the greater curvature of the stomach. And then this mesentery proper, or mesentery of the small intestine, securing the small intestine, and the mesocolon, or the mesentery of the large intestine, securing the large intestine, or the colon. The next big structure that we'll be looking at in the abdominal cavity is the diaphragm. It's this dome-shaped muscle that forms the superior wall of the abdominopelvic cavity. So right now we're getting an inferior look at it. It creates this separation between the thoracic and abdominal cavities. And you all know from our discussion of respiration that it's really important in respiration. Some features to be able to identify on the diaphragm: the central tendon. The central tendon is the thin but strong aponeurosis of the diaphragm into which all of the muscle fibers insert. And it has 3 openings in it through which the vena cava, the aorta, and the esophagus pass. So the vena caval hiatus, or foramen, through which the vena cava passes, and the esophageal hiatus, through which the esophagus passes on its way to the stomach, and the aortic hiatus, through which the aorta passes. And that allows for contraction of the diaphragm during breathing without constricting blood flow through those large arteries and veins. So next we'll be looking at organs that are present in the abdominal cavity and their structures. The first one would be indicated by this yellow space right here. So it's been removed, but this is where it would be sitting, and it's shown here on the right. So that's the liver. It's the largest abdominal organ in the body. It serves a lot of important metabolic functions, including detoxification of blood that's received from the GI tract, regulation of blood glucose, and the process of bile production, and a lot more. This is the falciform ligament traveling down the anterior surface of the liver and dividing it into left and right lobes. Seen between the liver lobes on the individual's right side is the gallbladder. And the gallbladder is serving as this temporary storage site for bile that's produced in the liver. And another accessory structure that we talked about in the context of the endocrine system, and it's also important in digestion, is the pancreas. The pancreas sits tucked under the stomach with its head tucked into that C curve of the duodenum where it secretes pancreatic juice. some of these ducts of the gallbladder system, so the biliary apparatus. So this is the liver reflected back over here on this side to show the inferior aspect and to show the gallbladder. So bile is produced in the liver, and bile flows through the left and the right hepatic ducts. And then the hepatic ducts, as we discussed in lecture, merge to form the common hepatic duct. The cystic duct is what drains into the gallbladder. So this section right here is the cystic duct. And at the merge of the common hepatic duct and the cystic duct, that becomes the common bile duct. That's going to lead to the duodenum. And it drains into the duodenum here at that hepatopancreatic ampulla, or the ampulla of Vader. If we start looking at the stomach is that enlarged J-shaped region of the GI tract immediately following the esophagus. There's the end of the esophagus and the start of the stomach. There are several regions to the stomach. The first is this part right here that receives food from the esophagus. That's the cardiac part of the stomach. The fundus is this dome-shaped region that's superior to and left of the cardiac region. The main part of the stomach is the body of the stomach. So most of the stomach is the body. And then the pyloric region is this narrow distal region of the stomach, which contains the pyloric sphincter, and that's regulating passage of acidic chyme into the small intestine. Other features of the stomach to know are the lesser curvature, that smaller superior border of the stomach, and the attachment site of the lesser omentum, and the greater curvature of the stomach, that large inferior border of the stomach, the attachment site for the greater omentum. If we looked at the internal anatomy of the stomach, we'd see the pyloric sphincter right here and right here. So it's a thick muscular ring around the distal aspect of the stomach. It unites the stomach and the duodenum. Inside of the stomach, you'll also see folds. So this is the very inner layer of the stomach. These are rugae. They're longitudinal ridges in the lining of the stomach. This allows the stomach to expand to accommodate a food baby. What we can also see are these three layers of the muscularis externa of the stomach. There's the outermost longitudinal layer and an inner circular layer, as we find throughout the rest of the gastrointestinal tract. There's also an innermost oblique layer, which has fascicles at an oblique angle, and that adds to the mechanical digestion that can take place within the stomach. Other organs that we'll find very close to the stomach are the pancreas. The pancreas has sort of that cottage cheese appearance, so it's coarsely lobulated. It's encased in mesentery immediately below the greater curvature of the stomach. It extends from the duodenum over to the spleen. The head of the pancreas is in the C-shaped portion of the duodenum. The body is inferior to the stomach, and the tail extends to the left up toward the spleen. So it's a large exocrine and endocrine gland. It's making pancreatic juice as part of its digestive function, which travels through the pancreatic duct and out through the major duodenal papilla. That pancreatic juice is lipases that break down lipids, pancreatic amylase bringing down carbohydrates, and bicarbonate that neutralizes that acidic chyme coming from the stomach. Another organ to see here is the spleen. It's a dark red structure. It's lying along the lateral curving surface of the stomach. It's oval in shape. It's a large lymphoid structure, contains a high aggregation of immune cells. It doesn't have any digestive function, but because it's so close in proximity to the digestive structures, that's why we're discussing it here. So now we're looking inside the abdominal cavity at the small intestine. The small intestine is that approximately 22-foot long portion of the GI tract immediately following the stomach. It's the primary site for chemical digestion and nutrient absorption. Passage of chyme through the small intestine takes approximately 6 to 8 hours. So the first section is the duodenum. The duodenum is the shortest segment of the small intestine, about 10 to 12 inches long. It extends from the pyloric sphincter down to the beginning of the jejunum. So it's receiving secretions from the pancreas and from the liver through that hepatopancreatic ampulla. And this is where acidic chyme gets neutralized by that secretions from the pancreas and the bile and the intestinal glands that also secrete alkaline secretions. The next segment is the jejunum, the middle segment. It's responsible for the majority of nutrient absorption as well as chemical digestion. It's about 2/5 of the length of the small intestine. And then the last section is the ileum, that last part of the small intestine, about 12 feet long. It's responsible for the final stages of nutrient absorption, and it's directly connected to the cecum, the first portion of the large intestine. On the cadaver, it's not going to be apparent from an external view where the jejunum starts and where it ends, where the duodenum ends, where the ileum begins, but you would be able to find where the duodenum starts. That's at the pyloric sphincter. So up here, this would be the stomach, and the pyloric sphincter turning into the duodenum right here. And then if you can find the cecum, the first part of the large intestine, then you'll be able to find the end of the small intestine. But everything else you won't be able to tell apart from this gross anatomical view. However, you should be able to tell them apart underneath the microscope by looking at those 4 tunics. The next section is the large intestine, and it's shown the space that it would occupy by this yellow highlighted area right here, and in cartoon form over here. So the large intestine is also known as the colon or the large bowel, and it includes that first pouch right here. That's the cecum. So the cecum is the first segment of the colon. It's a rounded inferior region below the entrance to the ileum. Hanging off of the cecum is an appendix. We called it the vermiform, meaning worm-like appendix. And this is primarily playing a role in immune surveillance. So monitoring the bacterial content within the large intestine. This section right here, that's ascending along the right side of the abdomen, that's the ascending colon. And we have the right colic flexure right here. Remember that a flexure is just where the colon is making a 90-degree turn. Once it's passed through that right colic flexure, then it's traveling across the abdomen. So crossing to the left side of the abdomen, that's the transverse colon. Then there's a left colic flexure, a 90-degree turn on the left side of the body, and turns into the descending colon, this segment moving inferiorly on the left side. At the sigmoid flexure, then it turns into the sigmoid, that means S-shaped colon. And this last segment is the rectum, that straight ending segment of the GI tract that stores and removes compacted waste from the body. One feature to notice on the large intestine is that the longitudinal muscle of the muscularis externa doesn't extend all the way around the lumen of the GI tract. It's just in these three thin bands of longitudinal muscle. And these are called the tennae coli. So these strings along the outside of the large intestine are the tennae coli, and they bunch the large intestine up into these characteristic pouches, and those pouches are called haustra. So the strings of the sweatpants, those are the tennae coli, and the pouches are the haustra. And here's just a closer view showing the cecum, that blind sac at the start of the large intestine, the appendix hanging off of the cecum, and this is the last portion of the small intestine, also known as the ileum. So here's the ileocecal valve leading into the cecum and then headed up into the ascending portion of the large intestine. This band on the outside would be the tennae coli, and this pouch would be a haustra. So your tasks are to read through Lab 15 carefully, try to address the questions at the end on pages 15, there's labeling on 16, 17, 18, and 19 and 20. So there's quite a bit of practice to do within the lab manual. I've also set you a visible body exercise for the digestive system. So there you can see some 3D images of the organs within the abdominal cavity. You can see some animations and overviews of the digestive system, and there's some self-quizzes for practice with the digestive system as well. And that's all going to be good practice for the gross anatomy of the digestive system. Additionally, I've provided a link that'll show some more images of the histology of the gastrointestinal tract, and that'll let you practice with getting familiar with the 4 tunics of the gastrointestinal tract and how they vary along different regions of the gastrointestinal tract. So please let me know if you have any questions, comments, concerns, and I look forward to seeing you in lecture today.